Thank you, Catherine, for that generous introduction. Somewhat humbling, I guess, to be in a room full of colleagues such as this. And I think really the running joke is the fact that I've managed to avoid yet another midlife crisis with another Young Investigator Award. I just want to quickly touch on the recognition and the high esteem that this particular award precedes me. This is not an exhaustive list, but at least to the early 90s, you can see a number of highly esteemed colleagues that have been provided this award, and I just wanted to recognise the foundation, newly established foundation, and the CNS committee for selecting me on this particular occasion. There's probably a few people here on this list that you might not necessarily want to be associated with, and maybe Jim House might be one of them, and potentially Peter Jones, but we won't talk about that so much. I also just want to recognise the sponsor, Pfizer Healthcare. I just want a little bit of trivia is in 2004, I received a Young Investigator Award from Pfizer Cardiovascular Division. And it seems about 10 years later, I'm receiving yet another Young Investigator Award from another division of Pfizer. So all I need now is for Pfizer to come up with another Young Investigator Award that I can receive in another 10 years' time, and I would be very grateful. Just in trying to echo the sentiments of the award recipient yesterday, Dr. Debbie O'Connor, in trying to think of how to present such an award and trying to make a brief yet sort of impactful message. The people in the room here are largely students, and I'd like to try and impart a bit of a mentorship message if I can this morning. And one of the things that I'd like to try and convey is that little mysterious concept of how does one go from a PhD to establishing one's program. And quite often when you're sitting in the audience as a young scientist, you quite often think, well, how on earth am I ever going to be able to create something that evolves into what I'm seeing now? And so what I'd like to try to do, which is sometimes difficult, but to thread just a theme along a few of the main milestones that I've been able to achieve, just as a way of demonstrating how a program can evolve through fundamental to preclinical and potentially clinical, even policy. So that's what I'm going to try and do today, and I'll try and do that in sort of a concise form. What I have on the slide for you there is that the evolution of two main themes in my program, which Catherine so kindly introduced. Originally, my training has been from a cardiovascular background, and I've tried to use those fundamental observations in applying that to nutritional sciences and also what that might mean in the clinic. So I just want to touch on maybe four main points. The role of intestinal remnant cholesterol in cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis. Just touch on some of the current model of factors that affect lipid and dietary retention in arterial vessels, the impact of some of the dietary fatty acids and some of their bioactives on intestinal lipid secretion, and the ongoing question of the clinical relevance of this particular pathway, the dietary fatty acids to ultimately some of the chronic diseases that Peter Jones was mentioning in an economic context just earlier this morning. So just to orientate you quickly for those who are not in the lipid field, I will be talking briefly about this particular pathway, in particular the pathway on the left-hand side, which is relevant to what we've ingested this morning and indeed what we ingest for most of our meals during the course of the day. I just want to highlight a couple of things. Both the liver and the intestine producing lipids. The intestine is obviously absorbing lipids coming from dietary fats and also bile source. We talk a lot about the right-hand side of the pathway in the form of LDL cholesterol as being quite bad and as a biomarker for some of these chronic diseases that we mentioned. What we talk less about, and what we have been interested in, is not only the impact of dietary fats and fatty acids in particular to the process of how these are repackaged and then secreted into these large chylomicron particles. And one of the things that distinguishes this particular pathway is the fact that the ApoB protein that can be measured in the blood from this particular pathway is slightly smaller than the ApoB particle on the right-hand side. So I'll come back to that. One other quick thing I'd like to mention that we have used in a lot of our fundamental studies is the fact that we have the ability to cannulate and sample from the lymphatics, which allows us to take pure samples of what's been absorbed and or secreted by the intestine directly into lymphatics before it drains into the plasma profile. And indeed, we can measure particle number through the ApoB molecule. We can measure lipids and also sterols, and we get a good sense of not only what the intestine is doing as a consequence of dietary intake, but we get an idea of what the intestine might be doing through some of these chronic disease situations. So I don't know whether you can see this slide very well, but this is just a cartoon, and what I have here is just a simplistic view of the artery lumen. This is where cardiovascular disease or cholesterol might begin to accumulate. Here's the endothelial lumen, and what I have here is just a range of sizes of the different lipoproteins that are thought to provide cholesterol and lipids during the onset of this particular disease process. And this particular cartoon was something that sort of struck me as being quite simple, yet was still not very well explored when I was starting out my PhD and became interested in cardiovascular sciences. At the time that I was beginning to get involved in this process, I was very interested in whether nutrition and dietary lipids had a direct role in cardiovascular disease. We talk about a lot of concepts of saturated fatty acids and how good nutrition and good lipids can affect cardiovascular disease outcomes, but at the time we didn't really have any evidence for the direct role of these lipids within the chylomicron pathway, primarily because we hadn't actually yet demonstrated whether these particles could contribute to plaque cholesterol per se, that being those particular particles getting inside blood vessels. And it was around about early 1980s that a fairly esteemed person in the field, Silversmith, proposed that cardiovascular disease could essentially be a diet, nutrition, or a postprandial phenomenon. Yet the evidence at the time didn't really support this hypothesis per se because of some of the limitations in the field. And so around early 80s was when a lot of these permeability studies to understand how these cholesterol particles are actually getting inside the blood vessel wall. And as I said, there were a number of landmark studies indicating that potentially size was a major factor in how these particles would be able to permeate the blood vessel wall, but there were some limitations, and I just note a few here. So at that particular time, we took this sort of cartoon and said, well, what are the limitations of the field? And one of them was that we didn't appreciate the very rapid hydrolysis of these large intestinal chylomicrons and how rapidly they were hydrolyzed to smaller particles. And it was these smaller remnant particles that we then tried to investigate a little bit more to appreciate whether they might actually cross the endothelial barrier, contribute to plaque cholesterol, and therefore might provide some direct evidence for dietary lipids having a role in plaque cholesterol. So we went about to develop a way of not only purifying these particles, but also to label them appropriately so that we can visualize them after an in vivo treatment, and we used confocal microscopy at the time to do that. Just to sum up a number of years of work, what I'm going to show you is very large particles on the left-hand side that are purified from the lymphatics that I mentioned to you, And you can not probably see very well, but in blue is the blood vessel wall morphology, and the yellow is the fluorescent tag on large particles, on medium-sized particles, and on fully hydrolyzed particles. And you can see from left to right the increasing amount of these particles beginning to permeate the arterial wall, the smaller they became. We were able to not only utilize fluorescence to compare one lipoprotein fraction, but also to compare these particles sourced from both the liver and the intestine. And we were able to demonstrate that, of course, both of these particles can permeate and can contribute to the disease. We utilized a number of animal models to demonstrate not only did both of these particles quantitatively get into intima, media, and adventitia areas in the blood vessel, but if you used hypercholesterolemic situation, you could also see a preferential uptake of some of these remnant lipoproteins within the arterial wall. What's also important is to keep a clinical mindset and perspective, and this is just one example of colleagues that have been able to do something similar in carotid arterial sections from humans using different antibodies, one antibody measuring ApoB100, another antibody measuring ApoB48. And because of the colouring, you probably can't quite see the differentiation, but suffice to say that both of these particles are present in human arterial lesions, making this particular concept very clinically relevant. So this is what we appreciate. We've contributed to the model over a number of years, that the intestine, through dietary lipids, bile, and others, will contribute these particles through the lymphatics. It will drain into the blood system. These chylomicrons will provide, obviously, triglyceride as a source of fatty acids and energy through lipoprotein lipase hydrolysis. As they get smaller, they are not only taken up by the liver to be reprocessed, but they can also contribute to plaque cholesterol, particularly over a number of decades. When I came to Edmonton, we were very interested in continuing this investigation to appreciate how these particles from the intestine might be regulated during chronic disease, and in particular diabetes. And we were interested in the fact that diabetic individuals are about 5 times increased risk of cardiovascular disease, but the mechanisms for which that happens, especially with respect to deposition of plaque cholesterol and how rapidly that accumulates, was not very well understood at the time. And so, as Catherine mentioned, I came to Edmonton to work with quite a unique rat strain. For those of you who are interested, this particular rat strain, which is right down here, the JCR LACP rat strain, has a derivative of the original Wistar colony during the early 70s, was backcrossed and came to Edmonton, and this is the strain that we've been using since. It does contain a leptin-resistant stop codon that renders the animal hyperphagic and gets a series of abnormalities that we like to refer to as a good model of insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. We've managed to apply this particular model in a number of different disease settings and questions since that time. To summarise quite a lot of work just on one slide, this is really addressing the question of how does insulin resistance accelerate some of those plaque cholesterol concepts and fundamentals, and what are some of the mechanisms behind that. We found that increased retention of remnant cholesterol can be caused by the over-secretion of cholesterol in enriched remnants from the intestine. And this was quite a new phenomenon, and we now know that those with diabetes also have overproduction of these particles from the intestine. The retention or the permeability of these particles was also increased during insulin-resistant states. and that these particles, it was caused by direct binding to some of the extracellular matrices, and that these matrices are also expressed differentially during diabetes, and that glycation can also make a difference. And we also used a number of different compounds targeting not only the intestinal absorption, but also lipid-lowering components to better understand how those pharmaceuticals might be beneficial during diabetes. This is a revised model. On the left-hand side, you can see the liver contributing VLDL through the LDL pathway, and what we have here is B48 and what I call the remnant pathway. And here are some of the factors that we realized were important in appreciating just how accelerated this process might come during chronic diseases. One being the number of particles or the secretion. The clearance of these particles is obviously important, the permeability and how robust the endothelial monolayer is. The composition of these particles, I didn't mention that these particles are a lot larger, therefore can contribute a lot more cholesterol on a one-to-one basis relative to some of the other particles in the LDL pathway. And there are a number of other facets and mechanisms that we continue to explore that we believe are very important in trying to appreciate all the factors involved in chronic disease and cholesterol accumulation in blood vessels. At the same time I came to Edmonton, it's very difficult not to be influenced by the nutritional sciences group there, and I can thank Dr. Field for her mentorship in asking the question whether long-chain fatty acids are bioactively relevant during the absorption process. And I just want to share with you a couple of quick slides just to summarize some of that work. And we were interested in appreciating whether some of the N3 fatty acids and also trans fatty acids might be relevant in this particular context. And so this is work from Zahra Hassan Ali, one of my first graduate students. She was able to show, using the animal model that I mentioned to you, that mixed N3 source of fish oil can reduce fasting blood and triglyceride and cholesterol in this animal model, which wasn't new. What was interesting was that we showed quite clearly a postprandial reduction in the lipid excursion, and that this ultimately was a cause of reduced chylomicron B48 particle secretion directly into the lymphatics. And ultimately, we were also able to show a relationship to a reduced pro-inflammatory response from the intestine, and that this was likely modulated by the activity of N3 fatty acids to a number of the PPAR mechanisms. In a follow-up study, which was a little bit more long-term, we also showed that the reduction in the intestinal cholesterol secretion, but ultimately didn't affect plasma LDL cholesterol, which was very similar to what we see clinically, but we also saw confirmation of additional reduction on lipogenic enzymes in both the liver and adipose tissue, and a marked improvement in insulin metabolism, which we believe was associated directly to the impact of these fatty acids on the intestine. And so from this work, we thought that some of these long-chain fatty acids actually do have a role to play directly on the intestine, and this is something that's not fully appreciated, at least in the clinical context. One of the other fatty acids we became interested in was vicinic acid, and that's because at the time the relationship between industrial trans fats was coming to the fore in its relationship with cardiovascular disease. And I think most of you in the room appreciate that there's been a positive association between partially hydrogenated vegetable oils and the risk of coronary heart disease, and that's been shown in a number of epidemiological and mechanistic studies. And we wanted to appreciate that the difference between some of those industrial source trans fatty acids and ruminant source trans fatty acids, because those molecules are quite different. And we knew that recent clinical and preclinical data continue to demonstrate a strong correlation between industrial produced trans fatty acids and CVD risk, whereas it was emerging that there was little or no adverse health effects between the intake of ruminant-sourced trans fatty acids. And one of the major ruminant-derived trans fatty acids in the food chain is vicinic acid, or trans-11 vicinic acid here. And so we embarked on some new studies, because it was very little known at the time, using synthetic vicinic acid to appreciate its bioactivity, specifically looking at whether it might have direct action on the intestine. Flora Wang is in the audience, and I have her to thank largely for a large body of work which represented her PhD thesis. I'm very quickly going to summarise in 2 slides. We were able to show through a long-term feeding study with pure vicinic acid did not have a detrimental effect on blood triglyceride and cholesterol, but actually the reverse. We were able to show that vicinic acid reduced the accumulation of hepatic triglyceride and associated enzymes, and VA also reduced the triglyceride and the lipoprotein particles directly from the intestine. And in a follow-up study, we were able to show the mechanism of how that might happen. Vicinic acid, like other long-chain fatty acids, also bind to the PPAR alpha and gamma family, and through a number of other colleagues and collaborations, we were able to demonstrate how VA may be acting directly on the intestine in a beneficial way. Some of you also know that we have a clinical trial ongoing which has had its challenges but is still in process, and the objective here is to try and use the approach of vicinic acid in those with high blood triglyceride, dyslipidemic, hyperlipidemic men, and the primary outcome will be to demonstrate whether vicinic acid has the same appreciation in humans as it does in a lot of the preclinical models that have been coming out in the literature. So with an appreciation of the fact that these particles are over-secreted during chronic diseases and can contribute to dyslipidemia, and that we can modulate this process with a number of known bioactives in the food chain, we began asking perhaps a more clinically relevant question: what would be the best biomarker for this particular pathway in order to be able to do that more effectively in clinical trials in people or even young people with chronic disease. So we asked, was ApoB48, a particle number marker, the best biomarker for intestinal lipid secretion? And this is important because, as I mentioned, both of these organs, the liver and the intestine, make ApoB. The liver makes B100, which is a slightly larger molecule. The B48 is slightly smaller molecule, and you can detect that and differentiate that in plasma. But we also know that the ApoB48 is present not only in newly secreted chylomicrons, but also is found in fractions that are a lot smaller, associated with smaller remnant particles. And so we needed to, for technical reasons, needed to try and appreciate what was the best manner to measure ApoB48 in plasma with respect to clinical samples. And I just give you an example here of why that might be the case. We have normal insulinic people on the left-hand side. This is a fat challenge. This is the increase in fat absorption and the clearance after the fat challenge. You can see here what we've managed to measure is whole plasma B48 concentrations. There's a total B48 amount, so this is the total number of particles over the course of that fat challenge. And then we separated out the newly secreted particles that are coming from the intestine that are solely based on that fat challenge. And what we realized quite quickly was that the newly secreted remnant particles were only part of the story, and we really did need to appreciate small remnants and the concentration of small remnants that already remained during the fasted state. And you can see here the difference here between newly secreted particles and the increase in B48 in whole plasma. And we did the same in mildly hyperinsulinic conditions in collaboration with Gary Lewis. And you can see here that the small remnant concentration was emphasized, and it said to us that perhaps whole plasma B48 was the better marker relative to some of these fractionated forms of B48. So over the years, we've been measuring fasting B48 in both control, healthy, and otherwise abnormal situations. And I can tell you for every single chronic disease situation that provides an elevated risk for cardiovascular disease, we find elevated concentration of fasting B48. Some of these we've contributed to earlier on when I was studying in Australia, and some of these measures down here are a little bit more novel, and one I'd just like to expand on the relevance and give you just a little bit of preliminary unpublished data on some of our studies in pre-pubertal obese children that are overweight and potentially may have early cardiovascular risk. This was a case control study that provided some proof of concept. This was a study that demonstrated elevated remnant lipoproteins might be increased in prepubertal children who are overweight relative to overweight children who were age-matched to lean children. This was the first study to report increases in fasting B48 in those who are overweight, and their concentrations were about 3 to 4 times greater relative to their lean counterparts. And this study also suggested there are early indications of pro-inflammation and insulin resistance in overweight children that were otherwise deemed normal. And so this was sort of a proof of principle for us, and we became a little bit more interested in trying to reproduce this particular situation. And this is the overall model that we're working with at the moment. During obesity or conditions of early overnutrition, we would submit that the intestine grows and extends in order to be able to absorb the amount of lipids and nutrients that are coming into the intestine in order to be an effective and larger surface area. During those situations, you might see increases in B48 secretion along with increases in triglyceride secretion, and that these particles effectively would contribute to circulating plasma concentrations of free fatty acids and triglycerides, which at least in the early stages the liver would help to compensate and would be able to keep a steady stasis and homeostasis of a correct balance of triglycerides and cholesterol. As this would progress, we would see the storage of a lot of this overnutrition into adipose tissue, as you might expect. This would ultimately slowly change the size and number of adipocytes, would decrease adiponectin and other cytokine production by the adipose tissue. And over time, as these children might mature and go into adulthood, we might see early stages of peripheral pro-inflammation as a result of the inflamed adipose tissue organ that might ultimately not impact on the liver in the most positive way, and ultimately end up with some consequences to decreased ability of the pancreas to modulate insulin, and potentially being defined as early increased subclinical CVD risk in these children. This is the model that we're working with, and we're very interested in this very early stage in order to try and have a very sensitive marker, if you will, in some of these very early stages to try and obfuscate and find ways of reducing this. We're doing this in a number of ways, and there are a number of ongoing studies that we have to retrospectively analyse remnant B48 dyslipidemia in children or adolescents. We have a number of collaborations ongoing, and I just want to finish with giving you some preliminary data from the quality study that we've been doing in collaboration with a colleague at the University of Alberta and also colleagues in Quebec. And so for those of you who don't know, the Quebec Adiposity Lifestyle Investigation in Youth study was designed to be a prospective observational study, children of 8 to 10 years old with at least one obese parent. There was a baseline visit, and at the moment there's 1 2-year follow-up also available, with about 600 participants at approximately 10 years of age, about half and half boys and girls, and about 41% were overweight or obese, and about half had at least one parent with metabolic syndrome. So this is quite a unique cohort, And we were interested in asking the question whether B48 is a more sensitive or earlier marker of central adiposity and metabolic risk than other traditional lipid risk factors. And secondly, to determine the B48 concentration associated with those at the highest levels of risk. I'm just going to give you 2 slides of data just to finish. What I can show you here is demographics at the top, adiposity from DEXA in the middle, the lipids panel in the middle there, and then insulin-resistant markers at the bottom. We've got baseline and follow-up here, so this is 2 years follow-up. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is that over the 2-year follow-up, you can see that total fat and central fat markers and central fat mass index all go up in those children over the 2 years. But what you can see as you scan down the lipid panel, there aren't very many lipids that also track or also increase at the same linear rate with adiposity. The only one marker that goes up in that same range is ApoB48. And you can see here that the measures of insulin at the moment are also tracking quite unfavourably in this short 2-year follow-up window. So at the moment we have a statement that says increasing age and maturity in these children despite a worsening of adiposity and insulin sensitivity. Most of the lipid parameters either significantly improve or don't change. ApoB48 is one of the only ones that continues to rise. And we think that's consistent with the model that I just showed you, that the intestine is adapting to that increased amount of overnutrition and trying to absorb as much as it can. And in order to do that, it needs to be able to upregulate its absorptive lipid pathways. The other data set that I can show you at the moment is that we've taken tertiles of the central adiposity index, and we've now got low, moderate and high children that fall into adiposity index, and we've just graded those about 200, 100 and about 150 in each group at the moment. You can see here quite obviously and clearly that total fat mass is going up as we go up from low, moderate to high. And you can see also that the triglycerides and other classic lipid markers also have some sort of trend to be going up along with ApoB48. But what I'll show you now here is at follow-up for those children who have either stayed in the low group, stayed in the moderate group, or stayed in the high group. And if you look carefully, the only lipid parameter that increases over that time, B48 from 3.8 to 4.3 in the low group. So if a child stays in the low group with that adiposity, they've still got increased ApoB48. If they move from a low group to a moderate group, they're also increasing more substantially. And of course, if they're in the higher group, they are at the highest level of risk, and the only lipid parameter that goes up to track with that relationship is ApoB48. You can see here for a number of the cholesterol measures, some of these measures are actually staying the same or actually improving during that follow-up visit. So the statement here is, again, with increasing age and maturity despite increasing adiposity, and I'm not showing you the insulin sensitivity data, but that also deteriorates. Most of the lipid parameters significantly improve on average, even in the moderate to high and central adiposity, whereas ApoB48 is the only marker that's tracking with detrimental outcome. So I want to stop there and really emphasize that this has been a bit of an evolution from fundamental to clinical questions for me, and I have a lot of people to thank. Some of the students are in the audience, and a lot of collaborators are in the audience, so I have them to thank for their mentorship, and at the forefront of that is Dr. Catherine Field, who managed to convince me that staying in Edmonton was going to be a good thing for everybody, and I have her to thank for that. And so I thank her for her mentorship and also friendship, and thank also a number of other colleagues that are in the room that have helped and contributed to the program thus far. So thank you very much.